In Algebra 2, Section 4.3, now that you know how to solve by graphing, we're now going to be solving quadratic equations by different methods for the rest of the chapter algebraically. So different methods that you can solve algebraically. So the first one is solve by factoring. So we're going to do backwards from multiplying out, or foiling as some of you guys know it. We're going to move backwards. So usually when you FOIL out or when you distribute, you get, there's like, you know, two bubbles. This one we're going from the equation and we're going to put it into a factored form, which looks like this. Okay, basically the answer again is the equation equals 0. What answer do we get if y equals 0? And that's what we're looking for, but now we're solving it quadratically. So if it's telling me that the equation in standard form is 1/2 and -5, this means that my answer is x equals 1/2 and x equals -5. So my first one, if I solve this, okay, let's go backwards. If I have the factored form here, right, and I have this, I'm thinking, and I move it into these factors. This is how I move it from this factor to this factor. Here's the key. I'm focusing on -8 and 12. Those are my two numbers. And I'm looking for two magic numbers that when multiplied together gets me the last number, but when added together gets me the middle number. So two numbers when multiplied gets me 12, but when added gets me 8. So I'm going to start with 12 and I'm going to factor. So different factors is 12 and 1, 6 and 2, 3 and 4. But here's the thing, when I add them together, they have to give me a -8. So these have to be negatives, right? Because when I add two numbers together, both numbers have to be a negative. So which one of these, when I add them, equals 8? Well, when I add these, this equals, when I add these, this equals -13. When I add this, this equals -7. When I add this, equals -8. So this right here is my key. Dun, 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 right? -6. So I'm going to put it into this form. 0 equals -6 and -2. I'm going to use these two numbers and set it up like that. Here's the thing. When I multiply this out, it should still give me this equation right here. Same equation, right? So basically, I'm not changing anything. I'm just rearranging it to make it easier to solve. And let me show you why this is easier to solve. This is easier to solve because if this is 0, then the whole thing is 0. And if this is 0, the whole thing, because these parentheses are being multiplied to each other. Anything times 0 is 0. So now I can have this in two simple problems. If x minus 6 is 0, it gives me the first answer. And x minus 2 is 0. Because if 1 is 0, the whole equation is 0. It's much easier than solving anything with a squared. So again, I didn't change anything. And once I do that, then I'm able to solve. I can solve this easily. This is the same thing. By doing +6 on both sides. X equals x equals 6, and I add 2, and x equals 2. So my answer is 6 and 2. So what this basically means is that I use factored form to help me, to tell me that if I were to graph this, my zeros would be 6 and 2, right? So what we're going to do, what number 1 is telling you is that they're already giving you the answer. So our answer is x equals 1/2 and x equals -5. They want you to write it in this, so we're going to move backwards. So now we have to make it equal to 0. So I'm going to write it here. We have x equals 1/2 and x equals -5. So I'm going to move backwards. We're starting here, and now we need to make it equal to 0. So I'm going to bring it to the other side. I'm going to subtract 1/2 from both sides. I end up with x minus 1/2 equals 0. and this is x. I'm going to add 5 to both sides so that the right side is 0. So x plus 5 equals 0. 1/2. It's not. These are not answers yet. What this is telling me is I end up with x minus 1/2 and x plus 5. So they didn't ask me in factor form. They asked me to put it in standard form. So I'm going to multiply it out. It's going to be x times the second, and then negative 1/2 times the second. So you take this term, multiply it by the whole thing, and this term, multiply the whole thing, and I distribute and combine like terms. So I end up with x squared plus 5x, and then that negative 1/2 x, and then negative 5 over 2. So then I end up with x squared, 5, I'm going to put it in decimal, so this would be plus 4.5x, and then minus 2.5. And this is, in fact, my answer, right? So what I did is I worked from here to here, got me the answer, but this one, it gave me the answer, so I'm working backwards. I set them x equals, and then I bring everything to one side to make it equal to 0. And then once I have that, then I have my factored form. But in order to get my standard form, I have to multiply it out. My next step is to solve x squared minus 2x minus 15. So this is the same thing we're doing here. I'm going to focus on my middle number and minus 15. Okay? Two numbers, when multiplied together, gets me my last number, which is negative 15. But when added together, gets me negative 2. So I'm going to take this last number, negative 15, and I'm going to factor it. So I have 3 and 5, but I also can do negative 3 and positive 5, or positive 3 and 8. One of them has to be negative. I can do 15 and stuff like that, but those are too big. I'm going to focus on these ones. So which one of these, when added together, gets me a negative 2? Well, this gets me a negative 2. This one would get me a positive 2. So these are my two numbers. Once I find those two numbers, I just rewrite it. This is x plus 3 and x minus 5. Now, if I'm not sure, just multiply it out like we did here, and I should be getting the same exact one. If I'm not getting the same exact one, something went wrong, right? So once I have that done, then I just solve two simple problems. X plus 3 equals 0, because if 1 equals 0, 1 parentheses equals 0, the whole thing equals 0. So x plus 3 equals 0, and x minus 5 equals 0. And I solve. Minus 3, which gives me x equals negative 3, and then plus 5. So x equals 5. So these are my answers. X equals negative 3 and 5. Don't put a comma in between them, because putting a comma shows that they're a point and they're not a point. So my answer is negative 3 and 5. So if I graph these, it would hit the x-axis at negative 3 and positive 5. So, well, that didn't. So go ahead and, that was a fail. Write this out, pause it, write it out, and try page 242, numbers 2 and 12. 242, numbers 2 and 12. And I'll see you in class.